Everyday use is a story that we study as it centers on characterization, but there are obviously other elements that we will consider as well. Alice Walker's work often focuses on women's rights, children's right to an education, African American heritage, cultural appreciation, and celebration. The Color Purple is one well-known work by Walker, and in it she addresses all of these topics. Everyday use also addresses those same kinds of topics, but one of them is more important in everyday use. And in our case, we see that not only does she address women's rights and a child's right to education, but it obviously focuses on African American heritage and cultural appreciation. Anytime you read a story, you should always look up words if you don't know what they are or don't know what they mean. Sometimes the context of the story lets you know what something means, but if you don't know what a word means, look it up. And as a general rule, write it down in the book so that you can see it when you come back to that part. I will say that electronic texts have that advantage in that you can look a word up without having to go anyplace else. But if you don't want to write in your book, get some little small Post-it notes and use those. But make sure that you know what words mean, because words are important. One of the things that we do as we read is to ask questions. Where does the story take place? How do we know where the story takes place? And how is that important for you? How important is that information for you to enjoy the story and understand the story? How does the setting affect the characters? Who is telling the story and who is a main character? What's the main character like? What is the narrator like? And how do you know that? You have to find evidence within the story that supports your opinion about what characters are like. What do we know about supporting characters? Can we see that some characters are alike and that some are different? Can we identify the central conflict and determine if it's resolved and how it's resolved? Anytime we read, we can find symbols within stories if they're there. It is something that has more than a literal meaning. The example of a wedding ring is a great example of a symbol. It is, first of all, a piece of jewelry, so it has a literal meaning. However, it also suggests other things like eternity, commitment, wealth, ownership. Those are symbolic meanings. So symbolism in art means that there is additional meaning. Things that are used symbolically should always first have a function on a literal level so that we can enjoy the story as it is, but then we can begin to see something deeper. One of the things we need to think about is what the quilt is, what it's made for, what it's made of, what it could represent or symbolize. There is a quilt in the story. In fact, there's more than one quilt in the story, but there is a specific one. I want to take just a second for you to look at some images of quilts that are particularly interesting as they relate to this story. These are images of quilts from Gee's Bend. Gee's Bend is a small community in South Alabama. And these quilts were made by the women there. These quilts are quilts made by African American women. They now hang, many of them, in the Smithsonian because they are recognized as being particularly important. So in much the same way that our character Dee recognizes both the utility and beauty of her grandmother's quilt. We see that our culture as a whole has begun to do the same thing. This quilt was also made by an African American woman. She is the subject of a chapter, A Woman of Importance, in Roy Ward's book, An Extra Eye. And pictures from that book were posted in a blog. Notice that this house would be very similar to the one that Dee returned to. And out of this came such an extraordinary work. In the book, Mr. Ward also published the whirligig, had printed pictures of the whirligig that hung from the ceiling. So we see things of beauty and we see things of utility in the same place, and in a place that is very poor. I mean, this was a woman who, these photographs were made in the early 1970s, which would have been consistent with the time period in which the story was written. And into this, as the mother sits in the yard waiting, comes her daughter, who has left this all behind, who is educated, and who is returning home. This image is a cigarette ad from the 1970s, but I thought it represented the kind of attitude that we might have seen in the character returning home. There is an article about Afrocentric fashion in the Clothing and Fashion Encyclopedia that you might be interested in, but this was a time of renewed interest in cultural heritage for African Americans, a cultural heritage that had been denied them because they had been slaves in the United States. That is, they as a people had been slaves. Now, when we look at quilts themselves, we think of them, they're made from scraps. The scraps may have been what was left over from clothing that was sewn. It was a way to use everything, so it was indicative of thriftiness and resourcefulness. It also is a source of warmth and comfort. They're beautiful, and they often tell stories or remind us of the past. When I look at quilts that my grandmother made, I see pieces of dresses that I wore when I was a child and pieces of dresses that my mother wore. And so those patterns evoke images of people and places and times. And notice, too, that there is historical evidence that quilts may have been used during the Civil War as a way of communicating messages and helping slaves to escape by the way of the Underground Railroad. Notice that then in everyday use, the quilt, a thing, can represent an idea. So it can represent or symbolize something that is treasured, thriftiness, resourcefulness, all of the things that quilts represent are things that the quilt in the story may symbolize. When we look at theme, we again look at a conclusion about the work after you have looked at aspects of the story, character, plot, symbolism. And we understand that a work of literature may have more than one interpretation, but whatever interpretation we have has to be supported by evidence from the text. It accounts for major details, and it is not contradicted by anything within the story. When we identify theme, we look at details, patterns, what has happened in the past, what do we know has happened before. references, allusions. There are references in this story to the cattle people who lived down the road. And this is a time of black nationalism, African Americans who were looking at different ways of finding independence within the larger American culture. We look at symbols. We look at the reasons things happen within the story. Why has Dee come home now? What has she come home to do? What does she do when she first arrives? And how does she respond to the people around her? We can consider the feelings of the main character, the thoughts and conversations of characters, the actions and behaviors, what the characters learn and what we learn about them, how they change, actions or events that represent ideas. When we look at character, we want to look at what the characters want and why. Do they get what they want? What does Dee think about her family or feel? What has she felt in the past? What does she feel now? Based on what we understand from the story. How does Maggie feel? How does the mother feel? What is the different experience of the mother to that of her daughter who has moved to the city and been educated? And think about why and how the characters change. Has Dee changed over time? If so, how? What in the story tells us that? Has the mother changed? What in the story shows us that she has changed? What about Maggie? Does she change at all? And if so, what in the story shows us that she has? When we consider the theme of this story, we want to look at the difference between objects that are meant solely for decoration and objects that are meant for use. What's the difference between appreciating the beauty of something and being able to create that thing? How do people learn to appreciate their heritage? How do they honor their ancestors, whether it is in this culture or another? Within the culture of the story, how are people showing appreciation for their heritage, and what do they understand their heritage to be? How does Dee Wangaroo see her mother's heritage and Maggie's heritage as a false one? But why now has she come back to take a part of those things that represent that heritage? Remember, when you are stating the theme, it is in a complete thought. It is a generalization about people and life. It should not be vague. It should not exaggerate. It should not overgeneralize. It identifies main ideas, insights. It is not minor. It does not deal with minor themes, but main ideas. It is the controlling idea of the story. You do need to account for all the major elements. You need to account for the mother, for the husband, boyfriend, the quilt, how the story ends. And again, it's not about how we as individuals fit into the story. You're not trying to identify a moral. This is not about right and wrong. This is about what do we learn about human beings and how we relate to each other, and in this case, our past. Heritage is that which is transmitted from the past. Hakim has found his heritage in Islam, Muslim Africa, and the Arabic tradition. Dee is finding heritage, a connection to heritage, by changing to an African name and looking to tribal Africa. What about the mother and Maggie? Their heritage is in the form of arts and crafts, things that have both beauty and utility, things that are art but also are intended for everyday use. Think about Dee's photographs, about her attitude, about how she has adopted the values of others who now see the arts and crafts as something that is priceless. And what larger cultural conflict is being addressed? This story is set at a time when African Americans were struggling for their civil rights and were recognizing what had been taken from them by the chapter of slavery that is a part of their lives in the United States. In that regard, one thing that had taken place during this period of time was the miniseries Roots. And so there was a renewed interest in the ancestry of those who were African American, much as people do genealogy, look at our family trees. There was a renewed interest in the African American family tree. Remember that the mother is the narrator, and she is a filter through which we as readers experience the story. She has a limited education. She has a limited awareness of the outside world. But she can be seen as a fairly reliable reporter of what is taking place and what has happened and transpired. But her perspective is from the yard, from this house. The daughter returning home has a different perspective of the world than her mother and her younger sister. When we look at the story in total, what are we learning about human beings? We can look at it as family dynamics, but we can also look at it as a part of a larger culture.